students. In today's session, I welcome you all to a lecture on feminist theories. This lecture will broadly give you an overview of the various feminist theoretical traditions starting from late 18th century to present times. What these feminist theories try to do is basically to provide a systematic explanation of the gender inequality in society. In this presentation, we will broadly talk about the following themes. First, we will begin with what is a feminist theory. Then, we will move over to the various theoretical traditions within feminism. And then, we will discuss some of the famous feminist theoreticians of the world and what they have talked about in their celebrated works. And finally, we will also discuss briefly what is distinctive about these broad approaches. Before we move on to what is a feminist theory, I want to briefly talk about what is theory. In sociology, theory is something that provides a systematic explanation of the social world. It is a logically coherent set of ideas that explain a social phenomena. Another way of defining a theory that it provides a lens to make sense of the social world. It is a framework to see the social world. And an important characteristic of theory is that it is open to critique. It is open to evaluation. It is subject to revision. And it is also open to refutation. Thus, we see that one theoretical body is not something which is universal or which is constant, but we see the emergence of different theoretical bodies or bodies of thought to explain the same social phenomena. Now I move over to discussing what is a feminist theory. What does it do? Basically, feminist theories explain inequality between the sexes, which leads to subjugation and oppression of women. Another important characteristic of feminist theory is that it establishes a connection between theory and praxis. In other words, theories in feminism have always been in conjunction with feminist movements and activism. The theoreticians of these traditions have all been associated with feminist politics very, very actively. The context of emergence of these theories have largely been the West, that is, the continents of America and Europe. There have emerged three waves of feminist movements, which are called the first wave, second wave, and third wave feminism. These are basically three waves of feminism which are historically, chronologically ordered. First wave feminism concentrated mainly on equal civil rights for women. Second wave feminism, however, broadened the idea of equality to demand equality at every front, not just the public realm. The most important development in this phase of second wave feminism was the recognition of how women are discriminated and oppressed within their personal and domestic lives. The third wave feminism, it challenged the notion of universality of women and focused on the notion of diversity and differences within the category of women. The five major theoretical traditions that I will be discussing in this lecture are liberal feminism, radical feminism, socialist or Marxist feminism, ecofeminism, and finally, postmodern feminism. These theoretical traditions have been differentiated on the basis of the ideologies or frameworks they are linked up with, and not necessarily they are in chronological order. The first four waves of feminism emerged and coexisted during what is identified as second wave feminism, starting from the 1960s. Postmodern feminism, however, marks the beginning of the third wave feminism beginning from the 1990s. However, there is also another latest framework which has been labeled as post-feminism, which has mainly emerged as a backlash against the previous phases of feminism, pointing towards a failure of the feminist project. However, post-feminism is not going to be a part of this lecture. So what is common to these five theoretical traditions that we are going to discuss today? The first thing that is common to them is that they all deal with the issue of women's inequality and oppression in society. They identify the key reasons for it, and they also address the question of how to overcome inequality and oppression of women. Now we will begin with the first theoretical tradition, which is the liberal feminism. Liberal feminism emphasizes on equal rights for women in the public sphere, such as women's right to education, women's right to citizenship, and so on. It is basically based on an argument of sameness, that women are not naturally inferior to men. It basically started with the women's suffragist movement, that is the right of women to vote, which gained momentum in the US as early as the mid-19th century. Overall, this perspective emphasizes on an approach of reform. Some of the most important works within this tradition include the work by Mary Wollstonecraft, which is titled as The Vindication of the Rights of Women, which was published as early as 1792. The second important work, which I need to mention, is that of Simone de Beauvoir. Her work is titled as The Second Sex, which was published in 1949. And finally, I would like to mention the work of Betty Friedan, and her work is titled as The Feminine Mystique, which was published in 1963 and which officially is seen as the starting point of second wave feminism. Mary Wollstonecraft is a very important figure within the liberal feminism because she is seen as a pioneer of this entire movement of liberal feminism. Wollstonecraft argued for equal rights of women, particularly emphasizing on their right to education. She argued that women were not naturally inferior to men, but rather, given they had access to equal rights, they had similar potentials comparable to men. Simone de Beauvoir, on the other hand, argued that woman is always seen as the other of man, and therefore as an object and dependent on man. She raises the important question of woman's subjectivity that woman is an independent I and identifies it as a starting point of imagining woman as independent. The third important figure within this tradition, Betty Friedan, argues how professional role of women are equally important as her role as wife and mother. She gives importance to both these roles for being a fuller human person. Now we move on to radical feminism. The focus of radical feminism is on patriarchy, and it identifies patriarchy as a universal feature of human society. It identifies family as an institution which serves as a key site for generating patriarchal norms. The key issues that they focus on are that of reproduction and sexuality and male control over women's bodies. The overall approach of this theoretical tradition is on revolution as opposed to reform. Some of the most important works within this tradition include the work which is titled as The Dialectic of Sex, The Case for Feminist Revolution, which was published in 1970 by the famous feminist called Shulamit Firestone. Second important work, which I should mention, is by Mary Daly, and her work is titled as Gin Ecology, the Metaethics of Radical Feminism, which was published in 1978. Finally, the work by Andrea Dworkin, which is titled as Pornography, Men Possessing Women, which was published in 1981. Much like other radical feminists, Shulamit Firestone locates the reproductive realm and women's biological reproductive functions as the locus of women's oppression. She advocates a technological solution to the burden of women's reproductive labor, such as artificial reproduction. Kate Millett, on the other hand, argues that male-female sex relationship is the paradigm of all power relationships. And finally, to mention about Dworkin argues how pornography portrays women as objects and shows violence as intrinsic to male sexuality. And now we move over to the third theoretical tradition, which is the Marxist or socialist feminism. This theoretical tradition broadly addresses the problem or the limitations of Marxism, and yet it adapts it to explain the subjugation of women. They argue that struggle for women's emancipation is also a struggle against capitalism. The key focus of this theoretical tradition is on sexual division of labor, and they discuss the following themes within their discussion of sexual division of labor. Women's exclusion from the wage labor market, women's role in family and how it benefits capitalism and how it helps in reproducing capitalist relations of production. And finally, they also talk about inequality within the wage labor market, how woman is always accorded a low status in the job market, and they also speak about the issue of gender pay gap. Some of the most influential works of this tradition include that of Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, Juliette Michel, Alison Jagger, Heidi Hartman, and Sylvia Walby. While Rosa Luxemburg is seen as a pioneer in Marxist feminist tradition, who was also an active member of the revolutionary socialist politics of the early 20th century, more recent theories include Heidi Hartman and Sylvia Walby. Hartman defines patriarchy, and I quote, as controlling women's access to resources and their sexuality, which in turn allows men to control women's labor power, both for the purpose of serving men in many personal and sexual ways, and for the purpose of rearing children. Sylvia Walby conceptualizes patriarchy and capitalism as dual systems, working in tandem with each other. She argues that in capitalist society, the key sets of patriarchal relations are found to be in domestic paid work, domestic work, the state, and in male violence and sexuality. We will move over to the fourth theoretical tradition, which is labeled as ecofeminism. Ecofeminism links the concerns and issues of women's subjugation to that of nature. It opens up a new theme of woman-nature connection and points towards the triple domination of global South, woman, and nature. The most significant work of this tradition includes that of Maria Mais and Vandana Shiva's work, which is titled as Ecofeminism, which was published in 1993. Through her works, Vandana Shiva broadly argues that women, and particularly marginalized women, are the best protectors of nature and biodiversity because their livelihoods are most directly linked to nature. Thus, gender and environmental oppression are intrinsically connected to each other, and it is impossible to speak about one without any concern for the other. And finally, we will talk about postmodern feminism. To talk about postmodern thought in brief, I must mention that postmodern thought basically critiques the knowledge framework of modernism. Modern thought is usually traced from post-Enlightenment period in Europe, but postmodern thought asserts that there is no universal truth. Knowledge is always contextual or contingent, and it is shaped by subjective interests. In line with postmodern theorizing, postmodern feminists critique the idea of universal experience of women. They focus on knowledge, and they argue that knowledge, which is based on white middle-class women's experience, should not be universalized to speak about all women. One of the important body of thought within postmodern feminism is known as standpoint theorists. Standpoint theory is comprised of certain illustrious figures such as Dorothy Smith, Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, and so on and so forth. They make three principal claims. First, knowledge is socially situated. Second, marginalized groups are socially situated in ways that make it more possible for them to be aware of things and ask questions than it is for the non-marginalized. And finally, they argue that research, particularly that focused on power relations, should begin with the lives of the marginalized. Sandra Harding, who is one of the key figures of the standpoint feminism perspective, argues that it is the lived experience of the marginalized which gives them a standpoint, which ultimately enables them to produce better and more enriching knowledge. And I quote from her, standpoint theories map how a social and political disadvantage can be turned into an epistemic, scientific, and political advantage. An important strand of feminism which has emerged is that of Black feminism. Black feminism basically challenges the Eurocentrism of feminism. The term black here denotes not really the color of skin, but the subjective sense of belonging to and sharing the experience of being the marginal and the oppressed. It basically attacks the tendency of homogenizing the diversity across the experience of subjugation by different women divided along the lines of race, location, and so on and so forth. One of the most important figures of this strand of feminism is Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks, in her celebrated work, Anti-Woman, which was published in 1981, examines the effect of racism and sexism on Black women, the civil rights movements, and the feminist movements from suffragist movement to the 1970s. She is one of the pioneers of the intersectionality approach, and she challenged feminists to consider gender's relation to race, class, and sex. One of the important feminist strands which emerges in India in relation to standpoint feminism is that of Dalit feminism. And one of the pioneers of Dalit feminism is Sharmila Rege. Sharmila Rege points towards the importance of recognizing the unique experience of oppression by Dalit women in order to create knowledge from their own standpoint. And I quote from her, standpoints that homogenize women as an analytical category do not hold ground in the Indian context. A feminist standpoint of interlocking oppressions that would recognize the complex mediations between caste, class, ethnic, and gender oppression would be more connected to the living and the concrete, unquote. And now I move over to another significant strand of feminism within postmodern feminism, which is sometimes labeled as lesbian feminism, which basically talks about gender in relation to sexuality. What is unique about this strand of thought is that it challenges the distinction between sex and gender, the traditional distinction which has been made within gender studies, where sex is usually understood as something which is fixed and unchangeable, and gender as something which is socially constructed. This binary is sought to be challenged by lesbian feminism. One of the key thinkers of this tradition is Judith Butler, and her celebrated work, Gender Trouble, Feminism and the Subversion of Identity, was published in 1990. In this work, as mentioned earlier, she criticizes the distinction drawn by previous feminisms between biological sex and socially constructed gender. She asks a very critical question. Why do we assume that material things, such as the body, are not subject to processes of social construction themselves. The main thrust of her work concerns breaking the binary between man and woman, not just masculinity and femininity. She argues that the categories of men and women are socially constructed as fixed and unchangeable, but actually they are not. She brought in the concept of gender performativity, wherein she argues that gender is a performance. It is what you do at particular times, rather than a universal of who you are. And finally, I am arriving at the concluding part of my lecture today, and I would like to conclude by pointing out the following. As we saw, feminist theoretical traditions represents a gamut of different strands of thought that tries to understand the question of women's inequality and oppression in very many different ways. As we saw, in the West, feminism has long historical roots spanning across centuries, with both feminist thought and activism traceable from the late 18th century to the current times. Feminist scholarship and activism, however, has seen different cultural forms in different parts of the world. This, in turn, has urged feminist scholars to question what is meant by feminist intervention itself. Abu Lughod, for example, critiques a Eurocentric notion of understanding of women's agency in feminist interventions. However, in this lecture, we have concentrated on the most prominent Western feminist theoretical traditions. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you all again for my next session. Thank you.